The wedding dress hung like a ghost in the corner of the church, and Boon Carter could not stop glancing at it as though it might whisper a way out. The sanctuary smelled of wax and dry wood, of old hymns pressed into the rafters. Dust devils ribboned across the sun-baked yard beyond the warped glass, small tempests that rose, spun, and vanished. Little demonstrations of how quickly a life could be picked up and scattered. Boone stood rigid by the side window, one finger trapped in the collar of his only good shirt, as if loosening the fabric might loosen fate. 22 years old, and his future had been sold in the same flat tone a man used to sell cattle. Sterling Rhodes had named the price: marry the widow Kora, 30 years his elder, or watch the family ranch pass out of Carter hands after 3 hard-won generations. The town had plenty to say about the bargain. Men with clean boots called him desperate. Boys called him pathetic. A few laughed when they thought he couldn't hear and said he wasn't getting a wife so much as a mother. Their words clung like burrs he couldn't brush off. He wanted to punch Sterling Rhodes in his tidy teeth, to explode like the summer thunderheads that never brought rain, but he had nodded instead. A promise is a rope. Once tied, it burns the wrists to tear free. The church door creaked. Boone turned, expecting the preacher or some brave soul come to witness a spectacle. Instead, she entered, Kora, black as river loam, full-figured, erect, moving with a gravity that quieted the room by existing. Her graying hair was gathered back, not severe so much as practical, her jaw firm, her eyes an improbable green that caught lamplight and returned it as steady fire. She walked down the aisle without hurry, as if time had been told to behave. Boone's breath caught. The picture painted by gossip, shrew, burden, calamity, fell apart like wet paper. She stopped 3 feet from him and studied his face, not unkindly, rather as a person reads a weathered map before crossing a pass. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," she said, voice level and low. "Wouldn't you?" he answered before he could varnish it with courtesy. "What we want and what we need don't always travel together," she said. The line was simple, but it settled in him like a stake set true. From the front pew, Sterling Rhodes watched with the satisfied posture of a man who mistook leverage for wisdom. The church door creaked. The preacher cleared his throat, his Bible already open to the place where strangers become kin in 7 minutes. Kora's hand brushed Boone's sleeve as she took her place beside him. He felt it then, the faint tremor in her fingers. Not fear alone, he realized, but courage choosing to proceed anyway. The vows were spoken in a hush thick as summer heat. Boone repeated the words, and they came out rough, like a man unused to speaking beyond orders and apologies. Kora's tone did not waver. When the time came to seal the union, she rose on her toes and set a brief, dignified kiss against his cheek. Lavender soap lifted from her skin, mingled with something floral he couldn't name. He thought, unexpectedly, of his mother's garden before the drought took it, and his throat tightened. "Congratulations, Mrs. Carter," Sterling said, the moment the amen had finished echoing. His smile never reached his eyes. "Deed transfer will be completed tomorrow. Your debt is settled, Boone, provided you honor the arrangement. Any failure, and I'll call in every loan your people owe." "I gave you my word," Boone said through his teeth. Words are cheap. Character is paid for in action. He tipped his hat to Kora as if she were a clever transaction, and left with the measured stride of a man who never hurried because the world held its breath for him. The sanctuary emptied. A few neighbors offered tight nods and hurried retreat, as if proximity might smudge them. Silence pooled. The dress in the corner swayed on its nail, flimsy and luminous, and Boone hated it for reminding him of all he wasn't and never would be. "Where place or mine?" Kora asked at last. He almost laughed, except nothing in him remembered how. "I don't have a place anymore," he said. "Been sleeping in Miller's barn." "Then we'll go to my house, but there are rules." Outside, the light had slipped toward evening. A sturdy wagon waited, a rifle lashed beneath the bench. She climbed to the seat with unshowy competence. He joined her, awkward in his own skin. The horses leaned into their collars, and the wheels complained along the rutted road. "What kind of rules?" he asked when the town fell behind them and only the prairie watched. "First," she said, eyes on the track, "I don't cook or clean for grown men. I am not your servant." She let that settle. "Second, my bedroom door stays locked. A marriage can exist on paper while people grow ready for what comes after." Third, she hesitated only the span of a hoofbeat. "Don't ask about my first husband." "Why?" the question escaped. "Because some stories are graves. Open them, and things rise that don't belong in daylight." They reached her place at the edge of the dry creek, a cabin of weather-silvered boards, a fence mended more by patience than lumber. Inside, the world shifted again. Books lined the walls, real, leather-bound, well-kept. A polished piano occupied a corner, its surface catching lamplight like a pond at dusk. A map of the United States was pinned above a small desk, a scatter of careful notes marching across territories. "You weren't expecting this," she observed, removing her hat. "I wasn't expecting anyone out here to have a piano," he said, honest because lying would be an insult to the room. "My first husband believed education is the one wealth that can't be stolen. The rest is just things." She showed him a room upstairs, small, clean, a bed with fresh linens, a window that watched the back pasture. He sat on the edge of the mattress and let his head fall into his hands. 7 minutes, and the axis of his life had moved. He felt a boy and a man at once, ashamed of both. Music floated up then, slow, sure, melancholy, edged with hope. He stood in the stairwell, arrested by the sound. Kora's hands found the keys as if they were an old road, and the hymn she coaxed from the instrument was not in his memory, yet it told the truth about him just the same. "Are you planning to stand there all evening?" she called without looking up. "Or will you come eat?" He flushed, came down. On the table waited cold beef, coarse bread, plum preserves, coffee that smelled like a future. "You play beautifully," he said. "I had a good teacher," she replied. The door to that subject clicked shut just as gently as a latch. He reached for another question anyway. "Who taught you?" "Someone who's been dead 5 years," she said carefully. A small, unguarded fear moved across her face, like a cloud shadowing a field. And then the fear was gone, and the field was sunlit again. Hoofbeats broke the evening like a dropped plate. Heavy boots hit the porch. A fist hammered the door. Kora's eyes went to the rifle under the counter. Her voice went quiet. "Upstairs," she whispered. "Now." He stayed where he was. The vow had been short, but he had decided to mean it. The door didn't so much open as surrender. Wood splintered around the latch, and 3 men stepped through like a storm wearing boots. The leader moved first, tall, narrow-faced, a traveler's dust ground into the seams of a city coat. He had the look of a man who kept score and preferred the tally to end in his favor. Behind him came 2 rougher companions who scanned the room with greedy curiosity, their eyes catching on the piano, the shelves of books, the map pinned with a bristle of notes. The leader's gaze never bothered with any of that. It landed on Kora and stayed, a hunter recognizing game he'd tracked too long. "There she is," he said, voice smooth as a banker's pen. "Mrs. Thomas Maddox, or should I say, Mrs. Catherine Walsh." The name hit the room like a shell dropped into still water. One word, widening rings. Boone felt Cora's breath shorten beside him, but her posture did not bend. She stood with the rifle low, not leveled, a promise rather than a threat. "You have the wrong house," she answered, steady as early morning. "5 years we've been behind you, Catherine," the man replied, smile small and sharp. "5 years since Philadelphia. 5 years since you disappeared with what wasn't yours." Boone moved, putting himself a half-step closer to Kora without thinking, the way a man leans toward heat when the door opens to cold. "She has a name you'll use with respect," he said, "Mrs. Carter." The leader shifted his attention to Boone for the first time, amused by the interruption. "Who might you be, boy?" "Her husband." "How touching." The man's eyes flicked to Cora's hand on the rifle, then back. "A newly minted protector. Did she tell you about the bank, about the 50,000, about the documents she took when she ran?" Kora lifted the rifle an inch. "You'll leave this house," she said, "now. Not without what Mr. Brennan sent us for. Money, papers, he wants it all returned to its rightful owner." "The rightful owner," Kora said, and at last a small fire cracked through her composed tone. She set the rifle on the table, within reach, and drew a chair with a scrape that sounded like a line drawn on a map. "Then sit," she told them. "You too," she added to Boone, though her glance said what she really wanted was his nearness, his steadiness. The 2 companions looked uncertain, as if hospitality might be a trap they'd forgotten to prepare for. The leader stayed on his feet, but Cora's insistence rearranged the room around her. Boone poured, hands sure despite the hammering in his chest. The smell rose warm and anchoring. "Your employer is Marcus Brennan," she said, folding both hands around her cup as if to keep them from shaking. "You can tell him I didn't steal his money. I rescued the government's." "Lies," he snapped, but his word lacked weight. Somewhere under the polished cruelty, a question stirred. Kora nodded toward the shelves. Thomas kept a journal. He was a meticulous man. She crossed to the books, drew out a leather volume darkened by years of handling, and set it on the table with the care of someone laying flowers on a grave. He wrote every crooked figure, every laundered dollar, every bribe that turned a signature into stolen land. The heavier of the 2 companions, Jake, as the leader's snapped warning had called him earlier, leaned despite himself. "Boss." "Stay back," the leader said, but curiosity had momentum. Kora opened to a page near the middle and read in a clear schoolteacher cadence. "June 15, 1869, 12,000 in territorial funds deposited to a private account held by M. Brennan. Papered as consulting services for land evaluation, services never rendered. Notation, Governor Hartley's signature acquired via induction. Cross-reference to Ledger B, page 31. Jake blanched. "She's got names."
"She has lies," the leader insisted, though his faint sheen had begun to gather on his brow. "Performance is what your employer does when he calls theft a fee. I was a clerk, so I could read the river where it bent under the bank. Thomas asked questions and died for it. The coroner called it mischance. The men who carried the coffin called it a pity. I called it a warning." He tapped the journal. "Warnings should be written down." The second companion shifted his weight, gaze cutting to the door and back. "Boss, if any of this is true—" "It isn't," the leader said, more to himself than to them. He pulled his pistol, and the room, already tight with breath and heat, shrunk another measure. "Orders are simple. Hand over the money and the papers, or the new husband bleeds while the widow watches." Boone didn't feel brave, only present. Presence, he realized, is sometimes the shape courage takes when it's too tired to dress itself in speeches. He moved enough to keep himself between the gun and Kora's heart. Hoofpads thundered up the lane, more than 3 horses, moving in practiced formation. Torches smeared fire onto the window glass. The leader's head snapped toward the sound, calculation flaring and faltering. "Expecting company?" he asked, knife-edged. Kora's jaw set. "Those aren't friends. That's Brennan." The name made the room colder. The hired man exchanged glances that were almost flinches. Whatever cruelty lived in them, it had learned to obey a larger cruelty, and now that larger cruelty was approaching in person. Boone's mind raced, not with plans but with increments. The distance to the table, to the rifle, to Kora's hand, the angle of the leader's arm, the time it would take to cross the space between a trigger pull and a body falling. He tasted the iron in his own fear and decided to stay where he'd planted himself. "Before your employer arrives to tell more lies," Kora said, "understand this. I didn't run with money. I ran with proof. If I die tonight, a marshal in Denver opens a box tomorrow, and a man in Washington opens a letter the day after. Those names in this book don't stop at a judge and a governor. They branch. They bloom." "You expect us to believe you mailed a noose to the government and it just waited?" the leader sneered. "I expect you to believe a woman who has already chosen what she won't live without," Kora answered. "You can recognize that kind of choice when you see it." As if to punctuate her claim, she struck a match. The sulfur hissed. She lifted the tiny flame above the journal's edge, the orange curl reflected in her green eyes. The companions froze. The leader's gun wavered a hair's breadth. "You wouldn't burn your leverage," he said. "I would burn the piece I can replace. Copies exist. This one keeps me honest." The hoofbeats halted. Boots hit the porch, many and deliberate. The door, already broken, shoved wide yet again. And into the bruised light of the kitchen stepped not Marcus Brennan, but the shape of law, a marshal's star glinting, deputies fanning behind. The leader's composure cracked. The companion's obedience wavered. Somewhere outside another horse snorted, and along the far fence a windmill turned, whispering its thin song of balance. Kora held the match, steady as a metronome, and Boone stood where he'd chosen, ribs tight around a heart that had just learned how to step toward danger instead of away. Whatever happened next, the room would remember this moment, a woman seated at her own table, holding a flame above the truth. A young husband deciding a vow was a place, not a word. And 3 men beginning to understand that the story they'd been paid to tell about power was about to be revised.
The badge flashed first, star bright in the doorway. Then the man behind it stepped into Kora's kitchen as if he were entering whether he already knew how to read.
Marshal Tom Bradley was broad through the chest and careful through the eyes, a lawman whose boots had learned to lift before treading on somebody's pain. 4 deputies fanned behind him, silhouettes rimmed by torchlight. Their entry pressed the night back a pace. "Guns low," Bradley said, voice even, "hands where God and the government can see 'em." The leader of the intruders pivoted, pistol half raised, calculation jittering through his wrist. Jake and the other companion looked suddenly smaller, like boys dressed in their father's coats. Boone held his ground between Kora and danger, aware of his own heartbeat as a separate creature. Kora sat with a lit match held a hair's breadth above Thomas's journal, her other hand resting near the rifle. The flame's thin tongue wavered, but did not falter. "Evening, Marshal," the leader said, summoning a smile that made a poor disguise. "We were in the middle of a private matter." "Private matters don't usually begin with a kicked-in door," Bradley replied. His gaze swept the scene, taking inventory: broken jam, drawn gun, a young husband braced to be a wall, a woman holding the single most dangerous thing in the territory: proof. "Names." "Don't," the leader warned his men, but Jake blurted anyway. "He's Lyle Barrett, sir." Lyle's jaw clenched. Bradley's mouth tipped in something that wasn't quite amusement. "Mr. Barrett, you and your partners can keep your hands where they are and your feet where I can count 'em." From the yard came new hoofbeats, measured, purposeful, the cadence of a man who believed the world should part for him. The torches outside shifted, and into their orange glare rode Marcus Brennan himself, suit too fine for dust, face composed into polite contempt of a banker who thinks receipts are morality. He dismounted with a practiced swing and walked straight through the mangled doorway, pausing only to lift his hat as if the ruins of other people's thresholds were minor inconveniences. "Marshal Bradley," he said, arranging courtesy like silverware, "I was told you were a reasonable man." "Reasonable men like tidy warrants," Bradley said without moving. "I've got one with your name on it." Brennan's eyes slid to Kora, to the match bright as a star over the leather's edge, to Boone's broad shoulders set like timbers, and finally to the journal itself. For the first time, a seam appeared in his composure, hairline but real. "Catherine," he said, ignoring the married name, "put out the fire and we'll speak like civilized people. The last civilized thing you did was steal from children and call it interest." Her voice was steady, the match's glow catching the green of her eyes and making them look like lit glass. "You sent men to drag me back. You came to finish what you started in Philadelphia." Brennan's smile narrowed. "Possession is 9/10 of the law. And the other 10th is a marshal with a warrant," Bradley put in. He nodded to a deputy, who took a step. Brennan raised a hand, not in surrender, only in a pause. "Be certain what you seize, Marshal. Documents can be interpreted." "Numbers don't lie," Kora said. "They only sit quiet while liars talk over them." She dipped the match a fraction closer, the scent of warming leather lifted, bright and animal. "One more step toward that journal and it burns. I can replace this copy. You can't replace the life you plan to take to get." Boone didn't speak. He didn't trust his voice not to shake the air, and right now the air needed a surgeon's hand. He watched the small movements that meant everything: Brennan's fingers flexing, Ryle's knuckles whitening, Jake looking to the door like it had become a story's only exit, a deputy's thumb easing the strap from his holster. "Boys," Brennan said softly, without turning his head, "do your job." Lyle's gun lifted in reflex. In the space between breath and consequence, Kora blew out the match and swept the journal against her chest with one hand, while her other hand snapped the rifle up in a clean, practiced arc. The report would have been deafening in the small room, but the shot didn't come from her. Boone moved, because moving was the only honest thing left. He stepped into the barrel path just as Lyle fired. Sound cracked the room in half. He tore across Boone's shoulder, a burning line that spun him sideways. He didn't fall, would not, could not, until he felt Kora's hand catch the back of his shirt and ease him into the chair as if she were lowering a precious weight. "Drop it!" Bradley's command hit like a hammer. 2 deputies surged. Lyle's pistol skittered across the floorboards as a boot sent it into a corner. Jake flung his own weapon down and put both palms up, swearing he never meant to kill nobody. The third man froze between terror and obedience until iron cuff clicks made his choices for him. Brennan, stripped of his hired thunder, reached for a last storm. He snatched at the fallen pistol near the door, but a deputy's rifle barked once, splintering wood inches from his grasp. Brennan jerked back, both hands suddenly at shoulder height, the calculation in his face flipping through ledgers and finding only red. "Marcus Brennan," Bradley said, voice formal now, the room reorganizing around the words. "You're under arrest for theft of federal funds, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and a list of lesser sins we'll savor later. Hands behind." Cuffs bit Brennan's wrists. He tried on a final sneer and found it didn't fit. "You think a jury out here will understand the complexities of finance? They understand stolen bread. They understand dry wells and shuttered schoolhouses. They'll do the math." Kora's palm pressed against Boone's wound, firm and sure. Blood warmed her fingers. "Through and through," she said, assessing. "High, clean. You'll keep that arm if you keep still." Boone managed a breath that pretended to be a laugh. "Hard to keep still when you're the one holding me together." "I intend to continue." And in the quiet certainty of it, he heard a vow better than the one the preacher read. Bradley nodded to a deputy. "Fetch the surgeon from town and send Miller to sit on that porch with a shotgun in case any more of Brennan's friends discover their conscience late." The kitchen exhaled. The torches outside guttered, then steadied. Lyle and his men were marched out, their bravado shrinking step by step until it fit the shackles they wore. Brennan hesitated at the threshold, turned his head as if he might yet find a word to make the world obey him. He found only Kora's gaze, calm, unbroken, carrying 5 years of grief and 5 minutes of triumph in the same steady vessel. Whatever he meant to say wilted. He crossed into the night, chains whispering. In the aftermath, the room discovered its smaller sounds again. The tick of the stove, the faint whine of the windmill turning true, Boone's breathing evening into something he could own. Kora drew a clean cloth from a drawer, tore it into strips, and tied a bandage with practical gentleness, fingers deft and unhurried. "You saved the book," he said, woozy but stubbornly present. "I saved you," she answered, and did not look away while she said it. Then, because truth appreciates company, she added, "and the book." Bradley lingered a moment at the door. "You did right sending word to Denver," he told Kora. "You did righter standing your ground. But next time," his mouth twitched, "maybe let me arrive before the shooting starts." "I tried. He was early." Her glance slid to Boone. "So were you." The marshal tipped his hat. "We'll be back in the morning for formal statements. Tonight, lock what's left of that door and rest if you can." When the law rode off and the yard's darkness reclaimed its ordinary, Kora fed the lamp a turn of oil and set the journal on the table, not as a trophy, but as a tool waiting for use. Boone watched her in the quiet that follows storms, the kind where new air moves through a house like forgiveness. "Does it still count?" he asked, voice rough silk, "if a man is brave after he's already scared?" "It's the only kind that counts," she said. Outside, coyotes stitched their thin music along the far ridge. Inside, a ledger lay safe between 2 palms. A wound began the slow mathematics of healing. And a marriage that had started as a contract learned a new word, choice, and tried it on like a coat that, to everyone's surprise, fit.
Morning returned to Kora's house like a guest who finally knew it was welcome. In the weeks after Brennan's arrest, sunlight found new angles in the rooms, falling across the piano lid and the ledger's closed cover as if blessing two instruments that had done their work. Boone's shoulder learned the slow grammar of healing, clean bandages, careful washing, stitches like tidy fence posts in skin. Kora moved through those days with a deliberate gentleness that never once called itself kindness. It simply was, the way windmills turn and bread rises when the kitchen is warm enough. The doctor came and went, leaving a row of instructions that Kora already understood without being told. She cooled fevers before they could set, measured laudanum by the drop when Boone's nights ran hot with pain, and made broths that smelled like strength. When he tried to stand too soon, her palm guided him back to the chair with the same firm respect she gave to frightened horses, calm, unyielding, never cruel. He learned the particular pride of obeying good sense when it wore the face of the woman he had married. News traveled along the territory's veins faster than wagons. In the mercantile, the trial was recited like scripture, ledger entries cross-referenced, signatures read aloud, Brennan's face described as it finally found the color fear gives to men who believed themselves unpaintable. The journal Kora had saved became a chorus once the Denver copy and the Washington packet joined in. Together, they carried notes no courtroom could ignore. A telegram arrived on a windy afternoon, the paper crackling in Marshal Bradley's hand as he stood on their porch with dust on his boots and satisfaction under his mustache. 20 years in federal prison, he read, and the words landed in the kitchen like bricks set into the foundation of something that would stand. No parole. Funds returned to the Dakota's land office. Oversight reassigned. And, Mrs. Carter, your contributions noted in the record. Kora took the paper, eyes tracking the black strokes as if counting stitches in a nearly finished seam. The acknowledgement mattered less than the numbers earmarked for schools and wells. Thomas would have liked that part best, she said, and the name, in her mouth, sounded less like grief and more like gratitude. Boone, sling cradling his arm, felt a warmth that wasn't only the stove's. He had stepped into a bullet meant for her without a plan. Now the territory stepped toward a future that had discovered its own plan at last. He could sense it in the town's gate, in how men spoke more softly at the blackboard they erected beside the church to list school supply donations, in how women squared their shoulders when they passed the bank, as if reclaiming air they had been letting richer lungs borrow. A wagon crunched into the yard one late morning, sterling roads, hat in hand, coat plain where it had once been fine. The man approached the door with the humility of someone who'd recently met his reflection under less flattering light. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, he said, nodding as though the names themselves had weight. I came to set a book right. Kora held the door but not the threshold, letting him speak from the porch. Boone stood with his good shoulder against the frame, quiet as a beam. In light of inquiries, Sterling continued, choosing a polite word for what federal attention felt like when it landed on a ledger, I'm forgiving the Carters' debts, principal and interest, clean slate. The right thing done late, Kora said, neither cruel nor warm. What's the rest? The rest, he blinked. You profited from a drought of money and a drought of mercy. If you would balance more than columns, you can haul lumber to the new schoolhouses, donate wagons, pay carpenters fair. Sterling's mouth opened, closed, found the road. Yes, ma'am, he said, because men who love profit also learn to love survival, and sometimes the road between them passes through decency. He produced papers. Signatures were made where they should have been placed before hunger and humiliation. The porch became a courthouse where a different law, plain fairness, was enforced by a black woman's steady gaze. After he left, the yard felt larger. Boon exhaled a breath that had been trapped behind the ribs since before the wedding. "You didn't need a rifle for that," he said. "Not for him," she answered. "Some men only understand force. Others can be convinced to understand shame." Her eyes softened as they moved to his bandaged shoulder. "How does the arithmetic of pain look today?" "Improving," he said, with a bias toward staying put when told. Staying put did not mean standing still. As strength returned, he learned her house the way a man learns a new trail, where the floor creaked and where it did not, which window caught dawn first, how to sit at the piano and listen with his hands folded, not interfering with the silence that music needs around it. He fixed what the gunshot had not broken: a hinge, a loose board in the porch step, a length of gutter that wanted to lean when it should run straight. She repaired what the years had frayed: a quilt's border, a child's reading in the evenings for neighbors who came by shy and left taller, recipes that turned flour and hope into bread that made talk kinder. They practiced a small liturgy of ordinary acts. He ground coffee in the morning while she unlatched the curtains. She tied his sling with a sailor's competence when chores tempted him into foolishness, and he oiled the piano's actions while she tuned with an ear trained by grief and refined by stubbornness. On Sundays, he rode to Miller's to return a kindness already repaid 3 times, and she followed on foot along the fence line, reading the weather by scent. They began to share a vocabulary that hadn't existed between them the day vows were spoken. Words like ours and later and good, said without apology. The town learned another language as well. Where Kora had been discussed as rumor and reduced to the ugliness of other people's adjectives, she was now greeted with respect owed to a person who had placed herself between a predator and the future. Children shouted, "Mrs. Carter," when she walked by the half-raised school, their voices skipping like stones. Men who had once laughed at Boon's circumstance now handed him tools and listened when he explained how to set a post so frost couldn't lift it. One evening, when the sky threw copper across the prairie and the windmill hummed a satisfied note, Kora closed the keyboard cover with a soft click and regarded Boon in the lamplight. "Any regrets?" she asked, the question not a test, but an opening. "Yes," he answered. And she waited. "I regret not knowing who you are sooner." "And who was that?" Her mouth tilted, wary of praise. "The woman who pried a crooked man out of his chair without losing her seat at her own table. The woman who made the word wife bigger than anyone else's smallness." She did not look away, and in the quiet that followed, the house seemed to lean toward them as if shifting its weight to accommodate something new. She reached up, touched the line of his healed shoulder, and nodded once. Agreement, acceptance, maybe the beginning of permission to rewrite a third rule when the hour was right. Letters came from Washington, first official, stamped with seals, then less formal, written by a clerk whose wife had wept reading the ledger. Funds were allocated, then spent where they should have gone all along. A school bell, mended by Boon's careful hands, cast its note over the town for the first time, and people stood still in the street to listen as if a herald had announced good weather for the season ahead. Night fell at last. Coyotes stitched their thin laughter along the far ridge. Inside, lamplight lay warm on the table where the ledger once sat. In its place lay lesson plans and shopping lists, a ledger of a kinder kind. Kora breathed in and let the breath go, a woman easing herself into a life not purchased by another man's contract, but chosen in 100 unremarkable decisions. Boon banked the stove and checked the latch, and turned back toward her with that new word in his chest, the one the preacher hadn't given them, but they had found themselves. Together.
Dawn lifted over the prairie like a curtain, revealing a town that had quietly rearranged itself around a new center.
The bell Boon had mended waited in the schoolhouse belfry, its rope coiled like a sleeping serpent ready to sing. Kora stood on the steps in a dark blue dress that fit her like resolve, a ledger tucked under one arm, not the old book of crimes, but a neat register for pupils and supplies. She had slept lightly, as she always did before first days, listening to the house breathe, to the far-off wheel sigh of the windmill, to Boon's footfalls when he rose early to warm the stove and test the bell once more by feel rather than noise. He knew she liked to hear the first peal with the town, not before them. The street filled gradually. Boots, bonnets, children dressed in clothes salvaged from trunks and scrubbed within an inch of their threads. The little ones tumbled over one another like colts, their laughter tripping along the fence lines. Mothers smoothed hair and collars, fathers pretended not to stand taller in the presence of a building that promised their children letters to write their own names with. Sterling Rhodes arrived with a wagon stacked high with lumber and slate, a teamster at his side, his hat plain as if penance had a brim. He didn't step into the first row. He stood off to the side and watched, a man learning with his eyes for once instead of his accounts. Boon took his place beside Kora and kept his hands easy at his sides, the way a man stands when he is prepared to lift without being asked. The scar tugged sometimes when he reached high, a reminder of a room thick with gunpowder and a vow made real. But today it felt like a seam that had healed true. When Kora glanced up at him, the exchange said what they both preferred to keep unspoken in public. "We made it here. Now let them in." Marshal Bradley and his wife came with their two youngest, the badge tucked out of sight for once under a vest. Today, he had told Kora when he brought the last sheaf of paperwork, the only law in this room is the alphabet. He kept his hat in his hands now like a man at prayer. Kora stepped forward when the bell's first note rolled, and the crowd answered with quiet, the kind of shared silence that dignifies the reason it exists. She didn't stand on a crate or call for attention with her hands. She simply began. "Good morning," she said, and the words traveled, clear as a creek. "My name is Boon Carter. We have built this house for learning with wood and nails, but we will keep it standing with patience and work." Her voice did not thump for emphasis or reach for applause. It moved steadily, laying planks. "You have given lumber and pennies and time. Today you give your children, which counts more than all the rest. We will teach them to read and reckon. We will teach them to keep a civil tongue and a curious mind. We will teach them that a neighbor's difference is not a threat, but another way to say ours." No one had expected the first speech to be about we instead of I, and the town leaned forward, feeling the ground shift toward something more level. She closed the register and nodded to Boon. He rang the bell once more, and the sound went up straight as a flag. Inside, the desks stood in two neat ranks, smooth as promises. A single upright piano waited at the back, second-hand, a little sharp in the treble, but sturdy. Kora walked the aisles as the children found seats, placing a hand on a shoulder here, quietly separating two cousins there without turning it into a spectacle. Boon moved where needed, fetching a slate, fixing a wobbly leg, opening a stubborn window that had decided to stick out of sheer contrariness. He had learned the difference between help that interrupts and help that supports, and he practiced the latter until it felt like breathing. The first lesson began with names. Kora wrote each child's on the board, saying them carefully, insisting gently on the pronunciation that each family carried as a small inheritance. Some names came from far places and sat new in the room. She set them into the air with the same care she used for nails near the edge of a board. Secure, true, not likely to split under pressure. Mid-morning brought a surprise. Mrs. Alvarez, who had seldom crossed thresholds except those of church and grocer, appeared with a basket of biscuits wrapped in a clean towel. "For the children who forgot breakfast," she said. But her eyes were on Kora, and the look there said, "I judged you poorly. Allow me this correction." Kora accepted with a smile that said, "Corrections are part of learning," and set the basket near the water crock. At noon the yard filled again. Boys chased one another under the bell frame without touching the rope, an agreed-upon boundary enforced by pride more than rule. Girls chalked vines on the steps that became letters, and then little gardens of words. Kora ate standing, a habit she'd never managed to break, and answered 3 mothers' questions about primers, 2 fathers' questions about attendance, and 1 small boy's urgent query about whether numbers had names the way people did. "They do," she said, crouching to his height. "Some are even proud. You'll like 7. Boon caught Sterling lingering at the far fence and walked over. The banker's gaze kept skittering back to the door, to the hum inside. "It's a fine thing," Sterling said, voice rough with effort he didn't know how to admit. "It is," Boon agreed. He didn't offer absolution, he didn't sharpen the past. He let the present stand for itself, like a beam cut to length. "Mrs. Carter," called the marshal's youngest from the doorway, "can I ring the bell when we go back in?" "Not yet," Kora said. "We save the bell for beginnings and endings. The middle must do its work in quiet." The afternoon stretched like a ribbon of good road, reading, copywork, a lesson in geography that used the big wall map and the small globes of the children's eyes as they imagined the distance between their town and places whose names tasted new. When the air grew heavy, Kora moved to the piano and played a tune that stepped lightly, a polka learned long ago and softened until it felt like walking home. Feet tapped, fingers stopped drumming, attention returned. Near closing, a rider loped in from the north with a pouch and a grin, dust haloing his hat brim. He handed Boon 2 letters, one with a Washington seal, the other with handwriting they recognized now like family. Kora opened the first and scanned it, then looked up, eyes shining. "Funding for 2 more schools," she said, barely above a whisper, and somehow heard by all. The second letter was shorter. "Our eldest can write his name. He writes it big. He says it feels like being seen. Thank you." The room held the words the way a cupped hand holds water. Grateful, careful, not to spill. When Kora dismissed the class, she did not make a speech. She simply stood by the door and said goodbye to each child by name. The bell rang once more, and the town exhaled as if a long-held breath had finally found its way out. Evening came on soft. The last of the chalk dust floated in the slanted light like new snow. Boon latched the windows and checked the stove. Kora stacked slates in even piles and capped the ink. They walked home along the fence line, the sky purpling, the windmill singing its thin, contented song. "Today felt like when a tune you've practiced finally sits under your hands," Boon said. "Today felt like a door that opens both ways. For them, for us." At the house, the lamp cast its warm circle on the table where the old ledger once lay. In its place now, lesson plans with margins full of small ideas, a list of families who might need coal before the first hard frost, names of children who read ahead and those who watch the page like it might run. Boon added his own notes, roofs to patch, hinges to oil, a windmill out on the Miller place that had started to complain. He looked at Kora then, and whatever the town had seen that day, leader, teacher, anchor, he saw more simply, a woman at the center of her choices. He reached for her hand, not as a pledge this time, but as a habit. She let their fingers knit and did not look away. Outside, coyotes called and were answered. Inside, a life answered back in the quiet, ordinary ways it had learned, steady as a bell that rings at the right times, sure as letters that line up to make a child's name, as surprising as 2 people who had once been strangers, now standing in a kitchen practicing the daily art of building what they had once been told could not stand.